Is that the words proposed to be omitted stand part of the question, and I call the honourable member for Dunkley.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. At a time when Australians have experienced the highest levels of unemployment for many, many years, and where in many places, like in my home state of Victoria, for example, women's unemployment is still greater than 8%. At a time when our economy has suffered a shock, a recession, largest shock in a generation. At a time when we are seriously asking ourselves, does the fractured and fissured labour market deliver for people as much as it delivers for businesses? It is extraordinary that the government bowls up a piece of Fair Work legislation where their main intention was to allow employers to cut the wages of many of the same workers that we have lauded as the heroes of the pandemic. Problems in the industrial relations sphere, in the labour market, didn't start with the pandemic, but boy, have they been highlighted. You know, we think about what happened in Victoria in our aged care system and the tragedy of the lives that were lost during COVID because of failures of this government to have any sort of plan in place for infection control, but also because aged care is one of the industries, one of the labour markets where bit by bit employment has gone from secure, where people work for the one employer, they know where they're going to work, when they're going to work, what their hours are, they know the people that they're going to care for, they know the people who are going to be their employer, to almost predominantly a model where aged care workers are effectively, if not literally, independent contractors sent from workplace to workplace to workplace, not necessarily knowing where they're going to go, not necessarily knowing who they're going to care for, and subjected to whatever standards are in place in that workplace with little capacity to change things that are wrong, because they're not there long enough to have the sort of buy-in that many employees have in a workplace. You know, successful workplaces are ones where the staff and the bosses, the owners of the business and the people doing the day-to-day work are able to work with each other as well as deliver for the customers, are able to identify workplace problems and work them through and solve them, where workers feel, either individually or through their representatives, through their unions, that they're able to communicate with their bosses about their personal issues in their workplace or their systemic issues in their workplace. Contrast that to workplaces where there's no security of employment, where there's no relationship build-up between the worker and the boss, where unions are often not allowed in and struggle to be able to represent the people that they should be representing, and we get workplaces where there's no one person that doesn't want it to work properly, there's no one aged care facility that didn't have people in there that wanted to look after the residents, but where there is systematic failures. So this fractured and fissured workplaces, fractured and fissured labour market that we saw in Australia even before the pandemic should be a top-shelf issue for this government to be dealing with, because it's bad for workers. On the face of it, some businesses think it's good for them because it costs them less money, but actually it's bad for businesses and it's bad for the economy. And jurisdictions and institutions around the world have been talking about this and working on how to fix it for years and years and years. You know, the UK equivalent of our Reserve Bank have been talking about the fissured workplace and why zero-hour contracts and why insecurity at work a serious social and economic problem to be dealt with. The OECD has put out report after report talking about problems in countries around the world where enterprise bargaining is dropping, which means people aren't getting paid properly, they're not getting good conditions, and productivity is suffering. It's a person problem and it's an economic problem. And we have a government who cannot get past its ideological bent about the free market when it comes to industrial relations in order to be able to resolve it. And it's a disservice to workers and it's a disservice to the businesses that we hear over and over and over again from members of the government that they say that they're here to represent. The other problem, I mean, there's a lot of problems with this legislation, but one of the other issues that really needs to be addressed is the fact that apparently this bill that we are now debating is what the government sees as a result of months and months of roundtable discussions between unions, between business representatives and apparently government last year about where to go to deal with problems in our workplace. If this bill represents this government's view of what you do after you've consulted with people, then I suspect every single stakeholder group in this country is wondering what is the point of ever engaging in consultation with this government ever again? Because this is not consensus legislation. And most people can recall, remember when the Attorney-General and the Prime Minister announced all of these roundtables and these working groups and had the temerity to compare themselves to the Hawke and Keating years and had the temerity to suggest that they would come up with something that would resemble the Accord agreements. This is as far from an Accord agreement as anyone could ever come up with. And is it any surprise that a government led by men who have displayed an attitude towards their responsibilities as employers as one of don't ask, don't tell, and wanting to distance themselves from what happens in their workplaces that they're responsible for, are also refusing to take responsibility for what's happening in Australian workplaces. And when you have a Prime Minister who appears, by an answer he gave in question time last week, to not understand the difference between casual employment and the independent, fake independent contracting employment that Uber drivers are subjected to, then you should have real doubts about this government's ability to bring in any genuine reforms to the industrial relations legislation and our labour market. I also wanted to raise two other points that, listening to the Attorney-General and Minister for Industrial Relations answers in question time, occurred to me. Both the answers he gave today and last week. He has a bit of a riff about, oh, the Fair Work Act is Labor's legislation, Labor brought it in, it's Labor's fault, Labor did this, it's Labor's bill, it's Labor's bill. It seems to imply that once one party brings in a piece of legislation, that is somehow then set in stone for that party, and they can never say, you know what, when times change, some of those provisions have to change. The Fair Work Act was brought in over a decade ago, and over that decade we have seen an acceleration in the changes in the labour market that were only on the horizon at the time. We've seen an acceleration in artificial intelligence, in use of information technology. We've seen an acceleration in fractured and fissured workplaces. We've seen an acceleration in the use of labour hire, subcontracting, independent contracting, other ways of trying to set up the legal relationship between the employer or the business and the worker than simply straight engagement, where their pay is worked out either by an award or by negotiation through an enterprise agreement, or for predominantly higher income workers through an employment contract. We've seen casualisation of the workplace through for example, in the university and education sector, short-term rolling contracts over and over and over again. We've seen casualisation of the workplace through people being told they have to have an ABN because they're a small business, but yet every other aspect of their relationship with their employer, being told their hours of work, being told what they're going to pay, being told how they must behave at the workplace, meaning that in all other circumstances they are actually a direct employee. We've seen all of these things accelerate over the last 10 years. So this argument that seems to be being run by the Attorney-General that the Labor opposition can't propose changes to the Fair Work Act to deal with the changing nature of the labour market because we were in government when we introduced the Fair Work Act is just patently ridiculous. And if the position of this government is that you shouldn't be changing this legislation, then what are they here for? And the other argument that seems to be being run, and it was mentioned today by the Attorney-General and Minister for Industrial Relations, is that, well, this is traditionally the way that this has worked for the last 30 years. You know, this is the way it works about independent contractors, so why would you say you'd change it? Well, if that's the argument, I guess we should go back to the days where children were sent up chimneys to clean them, or down mines to mine, when men were lined up outside of factories to find out whether or not they could get any work that day, and if they couldn't, they were sent home, where women were working in predominantly sweat houses sewing, but again lining up and waiting to see if they could come to get some work, and if they couldn't, they were sent home. Because that's traditionally the way it was done. Why would we change it? We have to change it because the labour market today is not providing security, decent pay and decent conditions for people from the first day they start employment right up until the end of their working life. And Australians deserve better. Studies from around the world make it abundantly clear that higher levels of enterprise bargaining across workplaces and across industries lead to higher productivity, better economic outcomes for the countries and better wages for the workers and better profits for the businesses. Now, if they benefit everyone, then that's what needs to be done. This bill, the changes made to this bill to enterprise bargaining won't do that. They are based on recommendations from one side of the bargaining table only, and it's not the side that represents workers. The changes put in this bill to deal with casual employment deserve to be viewed sceptically, because remember, this is the same government that said when it put in a regulation into the Senate to deal with casualisation and double dipping that regulation would solve everything, but now apparently we also need legislation. This bill won't solve the problems that exist in industries such as the disability services. Last week I had a Zoom roundtable with disability service providers across my electorate. And in addition to all of the other problems that currently exist with the NDIS, not the least of which is the minister trying to ram through terrible changes under the cover of COVID, what NDIS providers are struggling with is the Uberisation of disability care, of internet platforms that are basically the Airbnb of disability care, where people who aren't registered disability workers are able to go out and tender for the work that the registered and experienced disability providers, who are not-for-profits, would have delivered. And where people who have NDIS packages and their families are often tricked into thinking they're getting the same service for less money, but they're not. And the motive of these platforms is not to provide great care. The motives of these platforms is to take over a section of the industry so that in 10 years' time, when they list themselves on the stock exchange, their shares are worth a lot of money and they make a big profit. So it doesn't matter if they undercut all the other providers over those 10 years. In fact, that's what they're trying to do. That's the problems in the labour market that this government should be looking to fix. A Labor government would.